there was this guy. My mother rented her house out in 8th grade. And I've told a lot of these stories. I'm not going to go back into them. But suffice to say, she rented it out to a lot of people who ended up selling drugs. Because in Long Island, when you were renting a room and you didn't have any credit, you worked in construction. And construction meant that you sold drugs. And then you also you did construction. But you also sold drugs. That was what it meant. And she rented it out to one guy named Dennis. Dennis was the only one in the house not selling drugs. He barely had any fucking money. And he was an older guy. He was an interesting guy. He was very spiteful. He went to Vietnam. He served in Vietnam, came back from Vietnam, had this thriving baseball card business. Him and his wife into parties, coke, booze, the whole thing, the whole 9 or the whole 8, coke. Him and his wife got divorced. I don't know why. Maybe he boinked somebody else. I don't know. Irreconcilable differences, whatever. And instead of giving her alimony, he decided to quit his job and go live in a van down by the beach, by Long Beach. Okay? He then moved into my mother's house, where he befriended me and my friend Shay, and he would tell us all these stories about, bar fights and Vietnam. And he was a cynic because he was old enough to have heard all the bullshit from every politician. And he ended, as many people do, in a room drinking wine out of a Burger King cup with ice in it, smoking a pack of Marlboro Reds a day, and saying the N-word. Now, that's neither here nor there, and I don't endorse that kind of behavior. I'm saying idealism ends usually there, is what I'm saying. If you don't have a healthy dose of cynicism, you're going to end up like Dennis. Dennis was not a bad man. He wasn't great. His kids hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, and they called him once, and he was so drunk, he answered, he went, hello, hello. And they went, hi, Dad. And he went, hey, what are you doing? And they said, I think I'm going to go. And he goes, whatever. After everything that happened, Dennis said, life in the big city. It was one of my favorite quotes he ever said. Life in the big city. My mother would go, the cops are going to probably raid the house because they were running a pretty big coke operation upstairs. And Dennis would go, life in the big city. My mother would go, your kids you haven't seen in 5 years called you, and because you were so drunk, they hung up the phone and they never want to speak to you again. Life in the big city. He would say that. He'd sit there holding his hunting knife in a chair, staring at the fire, drinking cheap wine out of a Burger King, big cup with ice in it, smoking Marlboro Reds, and saying life in the big city. He had a few other sayings. Now, these are not good sayings. I do not speak this way. And I could say it was a different time, but there was no time when this was appropriate. He'd walk around and say, there's an N-word in the woodpile. I don't know what that meant. I don't know why he would say that. He was a deranged man who had lost most of what you could ever get in life. He had nothing left. He's dead. You can't cancel him. You can't cancel Dennis. He died exactly as he should have, clutching his chest on a fishing boat in front of his brother. He was young. He was in his late 50s, early 60s, probably early 60s. And he had one last, he loved playing cards. And I don't endorse the sayings, but life in the big city, I don't think that was the worst way to handle everything. And Dennis had guns. Dennis had a lot of guns under his bed, in the closet. But Dennis had those guns in case somebody came into the house. He'd shoot them in the face. So he said, if he was sober enough to find a gun, get his finger on the trigger, thank God that was never tested, would have shot me. Would have shot me when I was just trying to do a line in the bathroom. like an 8th grader getting ready for school. But life in the big city is kind of where you end up in many cases. We'd sit there with my mother. They'd eat baked clams. They'd eat linguine with red clam sauce. He would smoke cigarettes while he ate. No one does that anymore. He loved beer. He loved wine. No hard stuff. He swore most of that off. And he was a good guy. I remember at my grandmother's funeral, after my mother's house was lost, Dennis moved into my mother's van. He came full circle. He moved into my mother's van, and then he parked it in my grandmother's driveway, and he would shower in my grandmother's house, and he would live in the van. And he would give me advice. He'd give my mother advice. Living in a van in a driveway in Long Island. He would say, this is what you got to do, and this is how you got to do it. This is how you must proceed. This is the way life is. And sometimes you'd kind of say to him, and he'd say, hey, I'm living in a van in a driveway. Life in the big city. Now, he never lived in a big city. No. Never lived in a big city. No. He'd been to the city a handful of times, but the city was not part of his existence. He was very comfortable on the marsh of Long Island. I remember he came to my grandmother's funeral. He moved in with another man in New York, another man in my town, and now this man had a son. And this man's son would get out of jail every 3 years and try to kill his father. This is a fact. He'd get out of jail every 3 years, go try to kill his father, and also try to kill Dennis. So, they'd have to jam the door shut and everything, like clockwork. Dennis would come over the house and go, Joey's out, tried to kill us again. And we'd go, oh, yeah, well, it's that time, So Dennis came to my grandmother's funeral. He goes, I just got a brand new gun. I said, oh, good. And he goes, and I'll tell you right now, he goes, when Joey gets out this time, when I see him, I'm just going to kill him. Before he even has a chance to make it onto the lawn, when I see him, I'm going to kill him. This is what people are using guns for. They're not using it as to form a paramilitary force to check the Orwellian overreach of government. Not that I've seen. They're using it for these types of skirmishes. And not that it's completely unnecessary, but let's not delude ourselves. Dennis was not railing against the state. He just wanted to shoot his friend's son before his friend's son came in the house and tried to kill his father and Dennis. That's all. I get it. Life in the big city. I miss Dennis. Dennis was, again, not winning any awards as a humanitarian. Who's not the most woke person. I think we've established that. He was not woke. He was barely awake, literally. What happens is you get old. What happens is you get bored. What happens is you end up sitting on a chair, drinking wine out of a Burger King cup filled with ice, staring at the flames. And no matter what anybody says, you look at them, you shrug, and you go, life in the big city. And you ain't nowhere near a fucking city.